The glittering void of the galaxy shimmered with the majestic splendor of the Eldar Empire, a realm of boundless artistry, psychic might, and ancient knowledge that had flourished for millennia. While other species lived in the shadow of superstition and warfare, the Eldar had ascended to a place of serene mastery, having perfected science and sorcery alike. In that age before their tragic decline, the Eldar stood at the height of galactic civilization, their craft worlds and homeworlds illuminated by the brilliance of craftsmanship, culture, and the luminous power of the warp that the Eldar wielded with effortless expertise. Yet that effortless life, untroubled by hunger or toil, was also dangerously close to stagnation, for in many hearts, complacency began to take root like a creeping vine winding around the soul. In the original timeline, that complacency would give rise to something far more terrible. Slainish, the doom of the Eldar. But here, in this alternate strand of fate, the Eldar recognized their peril before it was too late. Rather than succumbing to dark pleasure cults, they undertook bold changes that would alter the course of the galaxy forever, preventing the nightmare that would have birthed a chaos god from their collective excess. It began with small voices whispering warnings. Seers, far-sighted prophets, and reclusive mystics who walked the path of the farser and path of the dreamer noticed disturbing ripples within the warp. The immaterial realm, always turbulent, trembled with a swelling energy that felt ominously attuned to the Eldar's darkest desires. A handful of these prophets, led by a far-sighted and resolute woman named Averting, dared to speak aloud of the emergent threat. She and a small circle of seers had uncovered the threads of destiny leading toward the birth of a terrible entity, one that would feed on the psychic energies of the Eldar's unbridled hedonism. Averting knew all too well that if they continued on the path of rampant indulgence, the consequences would be unimaginable. Where so many others among her species believed nothing could threaten their unassailable empire, Averting's voice carried a hint of foreboding that pricked at the Eldar conscience, awakening them from self-indulgent torpor. Not all listened. At first, those who enjoyed the decadent revelries of the pleasure cults met her words with dismissal or scorn. It was unthinkable that the Eldar, lords of the galaxy, risked anything at all from their own amusements. Yet a slim minority at court, especially those who walked more disciplined paths, heard Averting's warnings and recalled ancient times when the Eldar had nearly been undone by their own arrogance. Though their empire was ancient, they knew that the Eldar had not always been so unassailable, that in the forgotten days of the war in heaven, other powers had once rivaled or even eclipsed them. And so, quietly, a movement began to form, one dedicated to preventing the cataclysm that the Farsers beheld in their visions. As these voices rose, a council convened in the luminous spires of the Eldar homeworlds. Eldar aristocracy, sorcerers, philosophers, and warriors of renown gathered in an austere amphitheater carved from wraithbone. Psychic runes danced in the air as Farsers pooled their energies to transmit glimpses of the potential future for all to see. Averting, leading the demonstration, shared images of horror, the birth of a ravenous deity within the warp, a cataclysm of psychic energy that would tear the heart from the Eldar civilization. Those assembled fell into hushed silence. They felt that raw dread in their bones, and the shimmering illusions of the future imparted an unshakable sense of reality. Even the most hardened naysayers present could not entirely dismiss the dreadful inevitability revealed in Averting's vision. Spurred by the clarity of those horrifying glimpses, an urgent debate took place. Some elder statesmen insisted that the idea of reigning in personal freedom contradicted the very spirit of Eldar identity. Others countered that discipline and self-mastery had been pillars of their people's strength in ages past, and that returning to a path-based structure of life was the only way to avert a cosmic catastrophe. In the days that followed, the initial wave of resistance gave way, for even those aristocrats loyal to the pleasure cults could not deny the disquieting resonance of the Farsers' messages. Moreover, scattered catastrophes, warp storms, psychic anomalies, and a subtle increase in demonic phenomena were escalating throughout Eldar territories. The warnings of Averting were unfolding in real time, and to ignore them any longer was to court oblivion. Thus, by consensus that bridged caste and ideology, the Eldar Empire resolved to transform their society drastically. It was not an easy decision, as entire cultures of indulgence, entire industries, and entire artistry movements had formed around the unbridled expression of desire. Nonetheless, the Eldar recognized that their very souls were at stake. The path system, once the bedrock of Eldar discipline, was reinstated with renewed vigor. Every Eldar was encouraged, nay, compelled, to adopt a path that reflected an area of focus, from the path of the artist to the path of the warrior, from the path of the seer to the path of the healer. In adopting these self-limiting structures, the Eldar sought not to stifle creativity, but to protect their minds from the insidious temptations that roiled within the warp. Increasingly, the greatest threat was not some external foe, but the darkest corners of their own nature, which threatened to manifest in horrifying ways. Behind the scenes, the craft worlds that had initially begun as mere wanderers of the stars were now strengthened. Many Eldar saw them as sanctuaries in case the reforms failed. Their wraithbone domes offered distance from the epicenters of decadent civilization, providing a place where the more disciplined segments of society could pursue their paths without interference. But there was no exodus this time. Instead of fleeing the coming doom, the craft worlds formed a network of interconnected bastions, each one dedicated to a specific path or set of paths. They became nodes in a grand design, weaving the Eldar realm together in a tapestry of renewed purpose. And within each craft world, the Farseers prepared wards, runic anchors, and arcane fortifications to shield the Eldar psyche from the latent energies in the warp. Collective will channeled through wraithbone architectures created a powerful resonance that further insulated the Empire from the birth of the dark entity they so greatly feared. Over decades, the pleasure cults that had once enthralled a vast portion of the Eldar population diminished in influence. The most extremist were banished from mainstream Eldar society, forced to either reform or be exiled. A few, overcome by obsession, refused to abandon their hedonism and retreated to form enclaves in distant corners of the Empire, where they continued their dark rituals. But these enclaves could no longer operate openly. Instead, they grew secretive, seeking out places far from the watchful eyes of the Farseers and the newly awakened sense of collective accountability. As the Eldar civilization oriented itself toward discipline, psychic wards, and a more measured exploration of experience, those enclaves became hotbeds of conspiracies that might yet unravel all the progress. Still, the Empire at large held together under the clarion call of survival, and the grand majority of Eldar understood that the cost of ignoring Athenir's warnings would be the end of their species. And so the centuries rolled onward, forging a newly tempered Eldar civilization. They did not lose their aesthetic brilliance or their boundless capacity for wonder, but they tempered their desires with caution. They learned to sing the warp songs with an ear for dissonance, always vigilant for the first stirrings of corruption. The Empire emerged from its period of crisis changed, but enduring. The dark god that would have been Slainish remained in a protracted state of gestation in the warp, never fully birthed, thwarted by the Eldar's withdrawal from the culminating moment of their collective indulgence. Whispers of that embryonic power occasionally rippled through the immaterium, but it found no single cataclysmic spark to transform it into a fully formed chaos deity. Without the apocalyptic fall that reduced the Eldar to scattered remnants, the political map of the galaxy took a drastically different shape. Though the Eldar recognized that the threat of chaos still existed, particularly from the ruinous powers that had plagued the galaxy since ancient times, the immediate existential crisis had passed. Now, the Eldar turned their gaze outward, resuming their stewardship of the galaxy with a newly invigorated sense of purpose. No longer was their empire an insular realm of navel-gazing aristocrats. It became a bulwark against the darkness, buttressed by millennia of wisdom and guided by Farseers who still held the secret knowledge of how close they had come to destruction. It was in this environment that other species began to stir in the galaxy. Humanity, whose existence the Eldar had observed with distant curiosity, was forging its own destiny among the stars. In the original timeline, the fall of the Eldar had coincided with warp storms and the age of strife that isolated human worlds. But in this divergent universe, the warp remained comparatively stable for much longer, its storms less fierce without the nascent birth of Slainish. Humanity, therefore, did not slip as deeply into that long period of fractious isolation. As the Eldar Empire endured, the course of human history changed subtly, though few among humankind understood why. They believed the warp was calmer for reasons unknown, that the stars were more hospitable, and that mankind's expansions across the cosmos, still halting and troubled, would not be so thoroughly severed by warp storms as they might have been. On Terra, the Emperor of Mankind rose to unify the world as he did in the original timeline, forging alliances and banishing techno-barbarian warlords. Yet his quest to create the Prime Arcs, those gene-forged superhuman champions, was shaped by a galaxy that was not quite so perilous or dark as it might have been. Nonetheless, chaos was still a malevolent presence, and the Emperor's secrecy about the ruinous powers did not waver. He worked within hidden vaults and gene laboratories to craft the Prime Arcs, determined to reclaim the lost human colonies scattered across the cosmos. But without the overwhelming chaos caused by Slaanesh's birth, the Emperor found that he faced fewer warp-related catastrophes. The scattering of the Prime Arcs still took place, but the tumult of the warp was not as monumental as it might have been, and so their journeys through the immaterial realm were somewhat less violent. Each Prime Arc still found themselves flung to distant worlds, to carve out their destinies until the Emperor arrived to gather them, but the timeline of that process subtly shifted. In the meantime, the Eldar took note of the Emperor's emergence on Terra. Their farcers, constantly scanning the futures, glimpsed a mighty psychic presence coalescing on the planet that the Eldar had once called an unremarkable corner of the galaxy. The Emperor's ascendancy was of interest. He radiated a potent psychic aura, albeit one carefully shielded. Diplomatic envoys were convened among the Eldar, some urging that they should move to influence or guide this nascent power before it could become a threat. Others argued for a more isolated stance. The Eldar had only just avoided their own destruction, and interceding too forcefully in the affairs of younger races might provoke unforeseen consequences. But the idea of letting a powerful psychic empire of humans rise without any conversation at all struck many as foolhardy. The Eldar, after all, still considered themselves guardians of the galaxy, even if they had not always lived up to that role in the recent decadent centuries. Thus it came to pass that a graceful Eldar delegation approached the solar system. They had chosen not to arrive in warships brimming with advanced weaponry, for their purpose was to observe and perhaps initiate dialogue. Warp gates and webway portals allowed them to traverse the galaxy at will, so they remained undetected by human sensors until they desired otherwise. On Terra itself, the Emperor had established a seat of power, gradually reuniting the planet beneath a single banner. When the Eldar craft emerged in high orbit, it caused a great stir among Terran defenders. The Emperor, whose psychic abilities stretched across the planet, felt the presence of these watchers beyond the sky. Before alarm could escalate to violence, the Eldar signaled their peaceful intent through a method of direct telepathic contact. The Emperor, intrigued, granted them an audience, though not without caution. He knew from scattered fragments of lore that the Eldar were ancient, cunning, and unpredictable. The meeting took place in a sealed environment within the Himalayan fortress that served as one of the Emperor's private strongholds. Surrounded by the best of the Proto-Astartes, enhanced human warriors not yet refined into the final Adeptus Astartes, he greeted the Eldar ambassadors. They were tall, lithe figures, clad in elegant robes that shimmered like living crystals under the fortress lights. Their leader introduced herself as Calariel, a farcer whose eyes glowed with hidden knowledge. Through crisp, measured telepathy, Calariel projected an air of poised confidence, and the Emperor matched her composure with his own silent authority. Words were exchanged in a mixture of high Gothic and mental communication. Curiosity flared on both sides as they regarded the possibility of a future that could align or come into conflict with each other. Calariel explained that the Eldar had recently overcome a great internal crisis that might have consumed them and wreaked havoc across the galaxy. Though she did not delve into the details of Slaanesh's near-birth, she made it clear that the Eldar had recognized the perils of unbounded psychic indulgence and had taken steps to contain the threat. The Emperor, for his part, spoke of his quest to guide humanity and shield it from the ruinous powers that lurked in the warp. There was a mutual recognition that each side understood the chaotic perils of the immaterial realm better than the vast majority of other species. Still, the question of how the Eldar and humanity might coexist remained. The Eldar, for all their sophistication, could still be haughty and aloof. Humanity, led by a being of unprecedented ambition in the Emperor, had a tendency to expand rapidly. Over subsequent decades, the Eldar observed as the Emperor completed his conquest of Terra and embarked on the Great Crusade. With the warp more stable than in the original timeline, the unification of humanity progressed more smoothly. Many techno-barbarian enclaves that had once been stranded through catastrophic warp storms found themselves reconnected earlier. The Emperor still required the might of the Legions Astartes, his superhuman gene-sons, to bring fractious human worlds to heal, but across the galaxy, whispers began to circulate that the Eldar were no longer absent watchers. There were rumors of craft-world fleets gliding through the void, of ephemeral Eldar guardians appearing to steer battle outcomes away from cataclysms that might tear at reality. On a few occasions, ragtag human militias claimed that Eldar rangers had aided them against orc invasions before vanishing without explanation. Over time, the Emperor himself encountered Eldar farcers on multiple campaigns. Sometimes, a small Eldar presence approached him to offer cryptic counsel regarding warp anomalies. Other times, they attempted to dissuade him from intervening on certain worlds that the Eldar believed should remain unspoiled for reasons of cosmic balance. These interactions were not always peaceful. The Emperor, ever suspicious of Xeno's meddling in humanity's destiny, refused more than once to cede authority over any region he intended for human colonization. Yet neither did he dismiss the Eldar's wisdom entirely, for he recognized that they commanded a deep knowledge of the warp that few other species possessed. Thus, what might have been a bitter enmity in the original timeline found tenuous ground for negotiation, purely because the Eldar Empire was still strong and cohesive. They commanded respect and fear in equal measure, and the Emperor, despite his overarching vision for humanity, was practical enough to acknowledge that direct war with the fully assembled might of the Eldar would be ruinously costly. Still, friction built. In the Outer Rim, certain human colonies had been reclaimed under the Great Crusade's banner only for Eldar fleets to appear, insisting that the Emperor's expansion risked disturbing sealed warp gates or ancient sites that the Eldar had protected for millennia. The Legions Astartes, by now refined into the gene-forged superhuman armies, were forced to negotiate with or forcibly remove Eldar enclaves that would not yield. The Emperor was generally reluctant to engage in open warfare with the Eldar, knowing it could spiral out of control, but the Imperium's creed was not one of compromise. For the Emperor, humanity's dominion was his ultimate objective. For the Eldar, the idea that the younger, shorter-lived species might overshadow them was both laughable and disturbing. And so the tension simmered, sometimes flaring in violent skirmishes. In these early days, a tentative balance of power emerged. The Eldar still dwarfed humanity's knowledge of advanced technology, warp sorcery, and the webway, but humanity was driven by an unmatched fervor for expansion, led by a genius-level psyker of unknown potential. Moreover, the Emperor's prime arcs, once discovered and brought under his banner, were each demigods of war in their own right, forging campaigns across thousands of worlds. The Eldar faced a conundrum. Though individually they were often more psychically gifted than humans, they could not deny the unrelenting momentum the Imperium displayed. Many Eldar craft worlds simply chose to keep their distance, maintaining illusions and hidden webway gates to avoid confrontation. Others, especially those who had turned away from the reformed path system or who still harbored grudges, tested the Imperium's resolve in small-scale conflicts. Amid these changes, the Emperor eventually recovered all 20 prime arcs, each shaping the Imperium in their own distinctive way. Some prime arcs regarded Xenos with scorn, demanding that the only solution was total human dominance. Others, more contemplative, wondered if alliances could be forged with these ancient Eldar, who had clearly avoided the cataclysm that should have ended their empire. The prime arcs, raised on diverse worlds, brought unique perspectives. For instance, the prime arc who had been raised on a planet with a hidden Eldar outpost might have grown up hearing rumors of these elusive alien watchers, engendering curiosity rather than hatred. Meanwhile, one who had witnessed Eldar raids might see them only as a foe to be vanquished. The Emperor himself did not quell these debates outright, instead preferring to keep his sons focused on the overarching goal of uniting humanity. As the Great Crusade progressed, it was inevitable that the Imperium and the Eldar Empire would clash in more earnest. Certain pockets of the galaxy hosted human worlds that the Eldar considered vital to their own tapestry of the future. Farseus insisted that if these worlds fell to unchecked human occupation, it would open dangerous warp influences or accelerate an impending doom. The Emperor, seeing no direct evidence beyond the Eldar's cryptic warnings, refused to yield ground easily. The first large-scale battles between the Astartes legions and Eldar aspect warriors thus erupted, illuminating the void with brilliant beams of energy and the roar of Imperial ordnance. These engagements showed that while the Eldar maintained their hallmark agility, stealth, and psychic prowess, the legions Astartes possessed near-limitless resolve and cunning. The result was often a brutal stalemate or a narrowly won victory on either side, further souring relations. Despite these bouts of violence, both empires retained enough wisdom not to escalate every conflict to total war. The Eldar recognized that a drawn-out conflict against the Imperium's vast numbers, combined with the Emperor's strategic brilliance, could strain even their formidable resources. The Imperium likewise realized that to engage the entire Eldar civilization simultaneously was to risk an alliance between the Eldar and other Xenos powers that might see humanity's expansionism as a common threat. Thus, negotiation and localized treaties became an ongoing reality. The Emperor attempted to glean knowledge of the webway from the Eldar, hoping to replicate or control it. The Eldar, in turn, tried to instruct or at least guide the Imperium away from certain cosmic dangers that the Eldar believed threatened everyone. In these uncertain times, individuals of both species stepped forward as reluctant diplomats, forging ephemeral truces that might last a generation, or merely a day. Within the Eldar Empire itself, the transformation after averting the fall produced vibrant internal debates about their identity. Even as they faced the Imperium's rising star, the Eldar wondered if they had stripped too much freedom from themselves in reigning in their passions. Some argued that the path system, while necessary at the time, now stifled creativity and spontaneity, making the Eldar civilization too rigid. Others retorted that to loosen those strictures was to risk a second brush with the doom they had narrowly escaped. Hidden cults, echoing the original pleasure cults from centuries ago, still lurked in shadowed corners, offering their members a taste of forbidden joys. The Farseus worked tirelessly to keep watch for the faintest sign that the ephemeral godling Slaanesh might still awaken if enough Eldar gave themselves over to unchecked indulgence. Yet the combined psychic might of the reformed empire largely kept that unholy birth at bay. Meanwhile, the ruinous powers beyond the veil fumed. Khorne, Tsench, Nurgle, and the embryonic essence of Slaanesh all eyed the Eldar with bitter resentment for having denied the Pantheon their newest sibling in its full form. The complexities of chaos, however, meant that new avenues for corruption always existed. Even absent Slaanesh as a fully formed deity, the allure of Tsench's hidden knowledge, Khorne's unbridled fury, or Nurgle's promise of twisted immortality found purchase in the hearts of disillusioned Eldar or ambitious humans. Cults dedicated to the ruinous powers cropped up wherever the warp's presence was strong and vigilance was lax. The Emperor and the Eldar Farseus both recognized that while they might stand in tension against one another, an even greater threat loomed from the Empyrean, one that could devour them both if left unchecked. In that climate of uneasy coexistence, a world-shaking event occurred that tested the fragile accord between Eldar and human. Somewhere beyond the eastern fringe, rumors of an immense warp rift began to circulate. Eldar Farseus read the threads of fate and discovered that a group of radical human psychers, chafing under the Emperor's restrictions, had foolishly delved into chaos lore. In their hubris, these cultists performed an unholy ritual that threatened to tear open a permanent gateway into the warp. Although Slaanesh had never fully manifested, the energies unleashed were enough to draw the rapacious attention of demons, who were drawn to the promise of a rent in reality. The possibility of a chaos incursion on a massive scale became terrifyingly real. The Emperor, upon discovering the existence of this rogue faction, dispatched a legion of Astartes and Custodes to eradicate them. Concurrently, the Eldar, having divined the potential cataclysm, dispatched a large contingent of warlocks, seers, and aspect warriors to converge on the site. Both forces arrived at roughly the same time, each suspecting the other of complicity or ill intent. But faced with the sight of demons spilling from a nascent warp fissure, they realized the dire necessity of cooperation. A tenuous truce was declared on the spot, for if they did not stand together, the entire sector might be lost to the horrors of chaos. The ensuing battle was cataclysmic. The swirling energies of the warp battered the planet's atmosphere, and demons of all manner slithered into real space, hungry for souls to devour. The Emperor himself arrived in a flash of psychic might, descending with a cadre of the custodes in golden armor. On the other side of the battlefield, Eldar Phoenix Lords stood with their retinues, stoic exemplars of Eldar martial tradition. For a fleeting moment, these two powers that had teetered on the brink of war became allies of convenience. Human psychers stood shoulder to shoulder with Eldar warlocks, weaving wards to contain the rift. Astartes formed disciplined ranks with their bolt guns roaring, while Eldar aspect warriors darted between them like living blades of color, slicing apart demons before they could manifest fully. In the center of this maelstrom, the Emperor and the Eldar Farser Calarial worked together to create a psychic bulwark. The Emperor's golden aura of raw power melded with Calarial's luminous runes, forging a barrier that repelled the demonic swarm. Their combined might staved off the catastrophic expansion of the warp fissure. Yet the energies at play were immense. Calarial could sense the embryonic consciousness of Slaanesh thrashing somewhere in the warp, eager to exploit the emotional energies of the Eldar if they faltered. But the Eldar discipline, honed over centuries of the path system, held firm. Likewise, the Emperor's unshakable will battered back the lesser demons that sought to feed on the psychic energies of fear and despair. The rift began to shrink as warlocks and librarians continued chanting their protective incantations. The Emperor advanced, blazing with psychic wrath, to the very edge of the swirling fissure, refusing to allow it to expand further. He reached out with a massive mental push, and with Calarial's help, he forced the breach to seal. In an eruption of blinding light, the warp incursion collapsed, leaving behind only scorched earth and the lingering stench of demonic corruption. The survivors stood in awe, battered but relieved. The threat, for the moment, was vanquished. In the aftermath, as Eldar and humans surveyed the battlefield, a glimmer of mutual respect emerged. Each side recognized that the other was a formidable bulwark against the ruinous powers. While old suspicions lingered, it was more difficult to demonize an ally who had fought beside you against the horrors of chaos. Some among the Prime Arcs, who had participated or witnessed the event from orbit, began to question the Imperium's unwavering xenophobia. Others, however, maintained that any alliance was a temporary marriage of convenience. The Emperor himself, ever pragmatic, took note of how effectively the Eldar harnessed psychic discipline. He also realized that, in some ways, the Eldar's near catastrophe with Slaanesh had made them experts on preventing and containing warp spawn threats. That knowledge could be invaluable for humanity. Yet the Emperor was still determined that mankind would not bow to alien influence. For him, the question became how to harness Eldar expertise without compromising humanity's destiny. As the galaxy spun onward, further events forced Eldar and human powers to interact. On distant craft worlds, councils debated whether it might be wise to more openly share the secrets of the webway with the Emperor in exchange for certain concessions, guarantees of non-aggression, or the safeguarding of specific maiden worlds. Some believed that in forging a lasting treaty, the Eldar could ensure that the Imperium would not disturb delicate energies or ancient Eldar sites that anchored the reality lines. Others insisted that humans, so numerous and short-lived, could never be trusted with the knowledge of the webway, for it would only accelerate their expansion and potentially invite disasters on a scale yet unseen. At the same time, the Emperor was shaping his Imperium. He recognized that his prime arcs were integral to its future, each overseeing massive expeditionary fleets. Because the warp was calmer than in the original timeline, the Horus Heresy or an equivalent fiasco had not erupted, at least not yet. The seeds of jealousy or discontent among the prime arcs were there, but the specific triggers that had once been set in motion by Chaos infiltration and Horus's ascension to War Master might unravel differently. Moreover, Some prime arcs had encountered Eldar, forging either bitter enmities or cautious respect. Indeed, one prime arc in particular, perhaps the one raised on a planet that had once been visited by craftworld Biltan, grew fascinated by the Eldar's approach to war, eventually adapting some of their rapid, precision-focused tactics into his legion. Another prime arc might seethe with an unquenchable hatred for the Eldar, viewing them as manipulative meddlers who prevented the Emperor from taking rightful control of certain key sectors. The swirling currents of politics, war, and prophecy converged on pivotal junctures. Here, the fate of the galaxy might pivot a dozen times over. The Eldar, older and more contemplative, strove to direct events so that the ruinous powers would forever remain at bay. The Emperor and his Imperium pressed onward with relentless determination, intent on building a humanity that could stand on its own. These conflicting agendas formed the tapestry of a galaxy that teetered on a tightrope between unprecedented unity and cataclysmic conflict. One particularly delicate matter arose when the Emperor discovered certain dormant webway gates deep within the Sol system itself. He recognized their strategic significance. If the Imperium could master the webway, it could bypass many perils of warp travel. But he also knew that the Eldar guarded their secrets jealously. Rather than seize the gates openly, which would invite immediate retaliation, the Emperor ordered covert investigations. Some of his top psychoscientists and mechanicum adepts ventured into these labyrinthine structures, seeking to unravel the technology that the Eldar had used for eons. Tension skyrocketed when the Eldar discovered Imperial intrusions in their sacred passages, leading to violent skirmishes within the webway's shimmering tunnels. The precarious peace that had formed after the joint battle against Chaos threatened to dissolve into open war. At the same time, lesser alien species across the galaxy looked on in confusion or dread. Orcs rampaged as they always had, their simple warlust unaffected by the high-stakes psychic game unfolding between Eldar and human. The Necrons, in their tomb worlds, stirred to life and took a cold interest in the re-emergence of an Eldar civilization that had not collapsed as expected. The Tyranids had not yet arrived in the galaxy in full force, but the eastern fringes hummed with distant shadows. And amidst it all, the presence of Chaos lingered, searching for a vulnerability. If the Eldar and humans ever truly united, the ruinous powers could find themselves stymied. But if they fought, that conflict would drench the galaxy in blood and tragedy. Perfect fuel for demonic ascendance. Matters came to a crescendo when one Primarch, known for his pride and ambition, made a secret pact with a group of Eldar exiles who still practiced the old pleasure rituals. These exiled Eldar believed the reformed empire was stifling their greatness, preventing them from achieving the pinnacle of experience. They whispered to the Primarch that if he aided them in reactivating certain forbidden rituals, they could help him harness raw warp energy to exceed even his father's might. The Primarch, resentful over perceived slights within the Imperium's hierarchy, allowed himself to be tempted by their promises of empowerment. He believed that, with this alien knowledge, he could surpass all of his brothers and perhaps even the Emperor himself. As the Primarch's personal fleet ventured deeper into the segmentum where these exiles lurked, the Eldar Empire received troubling portents. Athenir, centuries older but no less sharp, sensed a renewed pulse of Slaaneshi energy. The enclaves of the exiled pleasure cults had reactivated their darkest rites. Although Slaanesh did not exist as a fully formed entity, the energies that could awaken it, or some version of it, began to surge once more. The exiles planned to harness the Primarch's genetic potential as a potent psychic catalyst, drastically accelerating their forbidden project. Through arcane sorceries, they attempted to fuse Eldar and human excess into a swirl of potent psychic energy that might birth a partial incarnation of Slaanesh, or at least a powerful demonic entity hungry for the emotional frequencies of agony and ecstasy. Panicking, the Eldar Empire dispatched its best seers and a significant military force to contain the crisis. They reached out to the Imperium with warnings that one of the Emperor's own sons had strayed into a mortal danger that might unleash a flood of chaos. The Emperor, outraged that his Primarch would consort with traitorous Eldar, nonetheless recognized the gravity of the threat. He reluctantly agreed to a joint Eldar Imperium task force to confront the rogue Primarch before it was too late. This was an unprecedented cooperation that saw entire hosts of aspect warriors fighting side by side with Astartes' legions, guided by both Farseers and librarians working in concert. They converged on a remote Eldar world that had once been a center of hedonistic gatherings, now hollowed out but still humming with leftover warp resonance. The Rogue Prime Ark's flagship orbited in silent vigil, while below, the surface writhed with the telltale signs of warp corruption. Demonic shapes flickered in and out of existence. Eldar architecture that had lain dormant for centuries stirred with alien life, as if exhaling a breath held since the earliest days of the Empire's nearfall. At the planet's poles, swirling storms of warp energy crackled with pink and purple lightning, a sure sign that the exiles had harnessed potent psychic currents. If they were not stopped, the boundary between real space and the warp might tear wide open. The final confrontation was a tapestry of violence and heartbreak. Eldar Guardian squads advanced, supported by the lethal grace of striking scorpions and howling banshees, while wave after wave of space marines launched thunderous assaults. In the skies above, Eldar Nightwing fighters performed aerial dances with Imperial Stormbirds. Warp Spiders and Imperial Jump Pack troops tried to outmaneuver each other, occasionally joining forces when demons erupted in their midst. The Rogue Prime Ark himself, towering in Baroque, personalized war gear, had begun to radiate an unsettling energy. He wore a twisted grin, convinced that he could master the warp through the exiled Eldar's rites. Athenir led a cadre of Farseers who orchestrated protective wards, weaving them into the planetary ley lines to keep the nascent Slaanesh energies bound. Meanwhile, librarians of the legions Astartes poured their will into these wards, their psychic chanting blending with the Eldar's elegant runic rituals. This improbable alliance shook reality, forging a layered net of psychic power that shimmered above the battlefield. Without it, the entire planet might have become a seething demon world, a fresh wound in real space from which nightmares would spew forth. On the planet's central plateau, the Emperor himself made planetfall with a retinue of custodes. He strode through the carnage, each step radiating golden light. With a single gesture, he incinerated a greater demon of Tsench that had broken through the wards. Yet his face was grim, for he sensed the vile corruption in his prime arc, the genetic son who had spurned him in favor of illusory promises. When at last father and son confronted each other in the shadow of a once grand Eldar amphitheater, the ground cracked under the psychic pressure. The prime arc sneered, brandishing a blade that crackled with warp energies, the runes of the exiled Eldar carved into its surface. In a tremendous psychic duel, the Emperor sought to purge the corruption from his son's mind. The prime arc unleashed waves of raw warp energy that crackled with the synergy of human and Eldar indulgence, the unholy synergy the exiles had cultivated. The amphitheater groaned as the energies rebounded, shards of wraithbone spiraling into the sky. The Emperor's aura flared, golden lightning colliding with the prime arc's swirling pink and purple storm. Observers from both Imperium and Eldar held their breaths, many forced to shield their eyes from the coruscating brilliance. Farseer struggled to maintain the protective wards around the planet, worried that a single misstep could unravel everything. The prime arc's newfound power was formidable, but it was also unstable, built on the ephemeral foundation of warp-born illusions. The Emperor, by contrast, had spent millennia honing his psychic might. Slowly, inexorably, he pushed back, battering the prime arc's defenses. The blade cracked under the strain, its runes splintering. At that moment, the exiled Eldar who had orchestrated this ritual hurled themselves into a desperate gambit to salvage their plan. Channeling the darkest aspects of the warp, they tried to reignite the energies that would lead to a partial Slaanesh birth. But Athenir and her fellow Farseers moved swiftly, slicing off the exile's psychic link through a precisely targeted ritual that effectively exiled them from the cosmic tapestry of Eldar consciousness. With their ties cut, the exiled cultists screamed in despair as their essence was devoured by the warp energies they themselves had summoned. The prime arc, suddenly deprived of the psychic scaffolding that had bolstered his strength, faltered. The Emperor seized that moment, striking down his son with a searing blast of golden flame. A thunderous detonation rippled across the plateau, leaving behind smoking rubble where the prime arc had once stood. The Emperor, trembling from the exertion, stared at the broken form of his child. Heartbreak etched across his face. The Prime Arc was alive but utterly defeated, his body cracked by psychic overload. It would take the Emperor's greatest arts to restore him, if at all. The child's mind might remain permanently scarred or even lost. In the silent aftermath, Eldar and humans surveyed the devastation. The illusions of grandeur that the exiled cultists had woven melted away, leaving a stark vista of charred wraithbone and scorched earth. Yet the wards had held. The partial birth of Slaanesh had been thwarted again, and the rift between real space and the warp had not become a permanent scar. Exhausted Farseers sank to their knees in relief, while battered Astartes and Guardians lowered their weapons. Though the cost in lives was high, an even more calamitous disaster had been prevented. In the months that followed, a complex swirl of outcomes emerged. The Emperor quietly had his wounded Prime Arc transported to Terra for the best possible healing, and also to ensure that his treasonous knowledge did not spread. Among the Eldar, some saw the Emperor's willingness to act with unwavering force as a sign that he was no different from the other short-lived warlords in the galaxy. Others, however, acknowledged that his resolve and power had saved them all from a renewed brush with chaos. Meanwhile, the united effort in the final battle had fostered deeper cooperation between certain Imperial and Eldar factions. Those connections became the seeds of further exchange, albeit fraught with mutual suspicion. As time pressed on, the Eldar Empire persisted in its renewed vigilance, ever watchful for signs that the precarious spiritual balance they had achieved might slip. They continued to refine their paths, ensuring that indulgence never blossomed into decadent madness. The Imperium of Man, meanwhile, marched onward under the Emperor's guiding hand. Though pockets of hatred and xenophobia still churned within the Imperium, a practical acceptance of Eldar power settled in, at least within certain influential circles. Some within the Imperium realized that, against the encroaching threats of orcs, necrons, tyranids, and especially the ruinous powers, having a strong Eldar ally, or at least a non-hostile neighbor, could be invaluable. This posture was by no means universal. Entire chapters of Space Marines and large parts of the Imperial Army still believed in total human supremacy, dismissing Eldar claims to the galaxy as arrogance. Against the cosmic backdrop, chaos seethed with frustration. Deprived of the cataclysmic birth of Slaanesh, and now faced with two formidable polities that might, in extremis, cooperate against demonic incursions, the ruinous powers redoubled their efforts to infiltrate either realm. Cults sprang up in hidden corners of both empires. Not all threats would take the form of grand warp rifts. Subtle corruption, treachery, and manipulation would prove equally potent ways to unravel the precarious alliances and sow seeds of doubt. Yet, in this alternate galaxy, hope gleamed more brightly than it had in the original timeline. The Eldar had pulled back from the brink of their self-inflicted doom, retaining their empire, technology, and sense of responsibility. Humanity had risen under the Emperor's banner, tempered by occasional, if uneasy, interactions with the Eldar, thereby gaining greater awareness of warp dangers sooner. The Great Crusade pressed on, forging the Imperium from a position of relative strength and knowledge. Whether these two ancient species would ultimately forge a lasting peace or tear each other apart in a cataclysmic war remained uncertain. But for now, at least, the galaxy breathed in a moment of relative calm between storms. In that calm, the Eldar soared in their elegant craft worlds, once again guardians of the galaxy's fragile tapestry. Their shining armadas glided among the stars, watchful for any sign that their old sins might return to devour them. Within the labyrinthine spires of Eldar cities, artisans and mystics crafted new wonders, forging a renaissance of culture now that the greatest existential threat to their species had been averted. Farseers pressed deeper into the labyrinth of possible futures, searching for a path that would one day lead to the dissolution of the Chaos Gods themselves. Yet they still felt the tension of meddling with fate, for each nudge in destiny risked unforeseen consequences. Meanwhile, the Imperium's unstoppable legions marched to reclaim the lost worlds of mankind. One by one, renegade planets and petty empires surrendered to the Emperor's vision. The Prime Arcs, each accompanied by towering fleets, carved out new sectors of the Imperium. Scholars within the Librarius began assembling an unprecedented archive of knowledge regarding the warp, gleaned from reluctant Eldar allies. Bolstered by the stable warp conditions, the Imperium expanded with speed that surpassed even the Emperor's original expectations. But the presence of the Eldar served as a constant reminder that mankind was neither alone nor invincible in the great cosmic saga. In the decades following the thwarted partial birth of Slaanesh, clandestine negotiations took place at the highest levels. Calariel, who had fought alongside the Emperor against the demons, journeyed in secret to Terra. Within the Emperor's private sanctum, they spoke for hours, exchanging perspectives on how best to contain the ruinous powers. Though they did not reach a formal treaty, both recognized the near impossibility of bridging the fundamental distrust. There was a mutual understanding that cooperation in matters of warp defense was beneficial. For his part, the Emperor recognized that bridging the gap between Eldar and human was no small feat still. If it meant forestalling the horrors of chaos, it was a price worth paying. Of course, there were factions in both empires that whispered of treachery and insisted on eternal vigilance. Some Eldar believed that the Emperor sought only to acquire Eldar secrets to serve his grand vision of a human-dominated galaxy. Meanwhile, certain Imperial leaders believed the Eldar would inevitably betray them when it served their mystic agenda. This latent suspicion would not vanish overnight. Rather, it formed the bedrock of a delicate relationship that could tilt toward alliance or disaster, depending on events yet to come. Through all of this, one truth remained. The Eldar Empire had survived the doom of the fall. Countless Eldar lives had been saved from the psychic conflagration that would have birthed Slaanesh in the original timeline. Though the specter of that horror remained, never fully dispelled, the Eldar's continued presence reshaped the galaxy. Their artistry, technology, and psychic sophistication remained a dominant force, while the Imperium, led by an emperor who had glimpsed the might of an unfallen Eldar empire, navigated a more complex galaxy. The foes of both Eldar and humanity, orcs, necrons, emerging Xenos threats, lingered at the periphery, watching for any sign of weakness. Whether a grand cataclysm would one day unite Eldar and human in an alliance that might save the galaxy, or if mistrust and old grudges would spark a final, galactic-scale war, remained a question for the future. For the moment, the tide of destiny had shifted enough to grant both civilizations a fighting chance against the darkness that lurked among the stars. The Eldar had prevented their fall, and in doing so, they had given the galaxy itself a new possibility, a fragile reprieve where the seeds of unity might yet flourish, or the seeds of betrayal might bring them all to ruin. Though none could see the shape of the final tapestry, the warp itself seemed to sigh in relief at the absence of that singular, deafening birth cry that would have ushered Slaanesh into being. Somewhere in the swirling immaterium, uncounted demons raged at being denied their perfect feast. Yet hope, ephemeral though it was, glimmered. The Eldar path toward redemption and the Imperium's path toward unification were not destined to be easy. But as Eldar and human warships drifted apart after the last pitched battle, the emptiness of space seemed just a little less empty, charged as it was with the ghost of an alliance that might one day hold firm against the nightmares beyond. And in that slender possibility, the galaxy found a future unbound from the tragedy that once seemed inevitable, a future in which the Eldar Empire never truly fell, and the Emperor's grand design for humanity might evolve in ways even he could not have foreseen.